My name is Charles Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Cultural Pluralism in the Arts Movement Ontario, and we're very excited to host the forum that we have this afternoon, Navigating Precarity in the Arts, looking at what we might, as an umbrella term, call marginalized voices, but more specifically, voices from Indigenous artists, people of color, Black artists, South Asian artists, and so on, those who are supportive of these directions, and so on. Today is important to us because over the last month since COVID-19, and maybe more than that, we've been hearing a lot from funders, and not directly from artists or arts administrators, particularly artists and arts administrators who are working in some of the most difficult areas in terms of artistic expression and the precarity of existing on minimal resources, whether project or operating. So we wanted to really talk about that today to show the widespread concerns that we have, the challenges that we face, the voices we're putting out there in terms of advocacy, and the solutions that we are recommending that funding bodies, political leadership need to consider if we're going to A, get through COVID as an inclusive community, and B, if that is going to be strong after we move into whatever might be after this pandemic is done. However, before we start, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement and acknowledging the place that we are on here in Toronto, Thai Toronto, the home of many Indigenous peoples, the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and what is called as the dish with one spoon. We know there are many Indigenous nations or peoples who have passed through here where we may not have their names. And yet, by designating Toronto the dish with one spoon, no knives, just spoon, as a place of sharing, as a place where one could come and take from the earth what was necessary, leave the earth in the condition for the next to come by, and in that way steward the land to those who would need it afterward. And what an incredible legacy and thought about having a relationship with Mother Earth and with other peoples, to be able to say Mother Earth feeds us, shelters us, gives us the things we need to survive, and so we must take care of that in order to be able to take care of ourselves. It's a lesson we direly need at this point in time as we go through a pandemic, as we go through the resurgence of incredible social inequities that have existed, that we see in this day, the deaths, murders of Indigenous people, of Black bodies, and others during this moment as well, highlighting again the incredible inequities that we see in society. I'd be remiss, because we have people coming from other parts of the country, to not call out people from BC, the Coast Salish, Squamish, Haida nations there, moving over from the west to the east, the Blackfoot in the Midwest, and so on. It's really quite important. The Cree, which extend across eastern Ontario, eastern part of the country, and so on. It's their spirits which I hope we are enjoining with ours as we move forward together into this age. Having made that, our agenda for today, we have a variety of speakers, and they're all really working hard in their areas, everything from legal services to support for emerging artists in the visual arts, media arts, Indigenous arts, Black arts, looking at income precarity, looking at coalitions and the voices that they are raising now about the impacts of COVID-19 and what is needed so that the arts community can be truly inclusive. We've heard these words, equity, inclusivity, diversity, and so on. The Sapamo paper Achieving Equity or Waiting for Godot is not just a catchy title. I want to repeat that. Achieving Equity or Waiting for Godot is not just a catchy title. We do not see any arts council at this time living up to the spirit and intent of what Justice Rosalie Abella wrote in 1985 about equity. What equity means, who it should address, how it should address them, and the time frames required for a change to bring about, and I quote here, redistributive justice. Redistributive justice. No excuse about there's no new money. No excuse about historical organizations. Redistributive justice because many of us have been locked out of the systems in the arts. And that's a real challenge for us. I look at it this way. If I'm putting some palm on the hand. We are 10 years old. We exist on project funding predominantly. There are organizations that have been around for 60 years. And in those 60 years have been able to build up a base of funding, have been able to build up their staffing, have been able to build up their membership, have been able to build up their public support, have been able to build up their political support as well. And we get measured against that. Now, I'm happy to be measured against because I know we're doing very good work. However, we do not have that 50 years behind us, and organizations that say they're supportive of equity are supposed to be enabling us to get that. Not sitting back and saying, well, you do it. Right? That's what equity is about. It's an attempt to achieve, no more than an attempt, it's the commitment to achieve equality of outcomes, not just access, outcomes, that we should be at the same level at these organizations that they have been funding for half a century, if not more, if not more. So that's our concern. And when we look at institutions across the board, one of the examples we use in our paper is OCAD University, which makes it really clear that they are going to be looking at historical inequities as they face indigenous people, people of color, they've disaggregated people of color. To say it's not just all people of color, there are certain components within that that need higher attention. So for example, the cluster hire of 6 indigenous faculty, the cluster hire of 5 Black faculty. They made it really clear. This is what we're going to do and why and when it will be done. We're not hearing anything like that from any of these arts councils. And it's disappointing. They call us priority groups. My question is, when will we be treated as priorities? When will we be treated as priorities? What does that mean? It doesn't mean simply allowing us into the tunnel. It doesn't mean putting us in at the runt end of operating grants. It means we rise to the top in a specific period of time so we are at an equal level with other organizations who have been funded for half a century. It means acknowledging that the arts practices that we have come from a different aesthetic, come from a different tradition, have their standards of excellence as well. And those things need to be considered, thought of, and put into systems of adjudication where juries, if they don't understand it, they don't get to speak about it. They don't get to speak about it. So those are some of the things that we hit at in the paper. We make it really clear the time has got to change. We cannot be here waiting for Godot, you know, and if we're going to continue waiting for Godot, we have to call them out and say, you are not practicing equity. This is not equity. Don't give me that. Don't tell me you're concerned about anti-Black racism and you won't fund Black artists or you fund them at low levels. And you don't have special programs in place on how to enable these artists to rise to the top. That's not true. There is no equity there. So I wanted to start off with that because that sets the tone, I think, for the conversation we're about to have with the others. The format for the conversation is individuals will speak for about 10 minutes, 12 minutes, maybe 15 minutes max. And then we'll open it to immediate questions for each panelist. Kevin is moderating the chat room. And whatever questions we cannot ask today, we certainly will have the record. And so we'll be able to get back to you on that. For the chat room, when Kevin introduces a question or comment that any individual is making, he will not read out your name so that it will remain private. It's just the issue we want to really talk about, and so on. So our order of speaking, we'll begin with Martha Rands. Martha is the Executive Director of Pacific Legal Education Outreach, and has been doing some amazing work about the needs of artists for legal services, which SAPAMA we work with her on, and that report should be coming out very soon. It's both enlightening and scary. She will be followed by Alica Hall, who's working at the NIA Center for the Arts. It's a Black Arts Service and presentation presenter center. Kristina Lemieux of Generator in Toronto. Generator works with a lot of emerging artists, and as we're seeing these days, a lot of emerging artists are Indigenous, are people of color, are in the priority groups that these councils talk about, and support that her area is providing to those and the challenges they face. Kehinde Ba is working with WorkinCulture on the issue of income precarity for artists, which has really been heightened during this time of COVID, leading some people to begin to advocate for guaranteed annual income, not just for artists, but across the board, guaranteed annual income. Kehinde will be followed by Brenda Ledley. Brenda is the Executive Director of the BC Arts Alliance, and also, like me, a member of the Canadian Arts Coalition, which is now beginning to use the language that we're using in this afternoon. Camille Georgeson-Usher, who is the Executive Director of the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective, and has been very active since her appointment there around these kinds of issues, has been on several panels with us in the past, and it's always wonderful to have Camille with us again. Ben Donoghue, a long ally with us with SAPAMO since we worked with him and his Media Arts Network years ago. And he, with Jason Samilski of CARFAC, have been doing that letter campaign that some of you may have seen. Alida Ismail. Alida is with Diversity Artistique Montreal, and we have been connecting over the kind of work they're doing in Montreal and through Quebec, and the kind of work we're doing at SAPAMO to see how we might support each other, be in touch with each other, and so on. And then finally, Jason Samilski of CARFAC Ontario. He's the managing director there and has begun this letter writing campaign about the importance of these issues and getting a whole bunch of artistic organizations to sign them. So I'm going to keep quiet here, and I'm going to turn it over to Martha, who will speak, and then after she's done, Kevin will moderate the chat room. Martha, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Charles, for including us in today's conversation. Unfortunately, as our report is coming out next week, I will have to leave within an hour, so I won't be here long, and that's why I'm starting out. I put our URLs in the chat, and hopefully we'll get the report out to everybody who's participating today. And I wanna, before I go to my slides, which are about the report and what we found out, I wanna speak just quickly to two things. I'm glad you said it was enlightening and scary, because in many respects, much of what we're experiencing right now is enlightening and really scary. And I think we can apply that across a lot of different experiences, particularly the experiences of the Black community recently, as well as all communities, all priority groups, all marginalized folks. And I really hope that we get to a place of redistributive justice. It certainly is a place that we have been working from, as in preparing this report. And one of the things that we have done at Pleo is we, moving forward, offer workshops, public legal education to mostly nonprofits across the province of BC. And we will be making available those are paid workshops for free to members of communities of priority groups. And that will be our way of making available the information and education and advice to often people that are left out of the discussion, to make sure that they at least have access to what we offer, as limited as it is. And when I think a lot about legal services in this space, I have to also say how disappointed I was to find out that the two major surveys, actually there's multiple major surveys that have been done of the nonprofit sector more broadly across the country in the last 2 months, that legal services, that the access to justice was not included as something that the nonprofit sector ought to have access to. Not in Ontario, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, as well as the survey through the Vantage Point survey that was done through the City of Vancouver. So honestly, really misses a really key element that really does empower the next generation of leaders. So hopefully this will work. Yay. I hope everybody can see that. And I just worked on this morning. It's a work in progress. So we are proposing, we are a national network of legal clinics for the arts. There's 6 of us across the country. The report will be available next week. We have a URL, which is legalclinicsforarts.com. And it was a project funded by the Canada Council for the Arts, mostly, and involved 3 of the legal clinics, the Artist Legal Services Ottawa, Artist Legal Advice Services in Toronto, and the Artist Legal Outreach in Vancouver. We undertook a national legal needs assessment of artists and arts organizations in all disciplines. And SEPAMO was a key collaborator on that needs assessment. And that was a deliberate choice on our part to ensure that when we were engaging with the community, that we were able to, at some level, ensure inclusivity of organizations that are often not asked for their thoughts, as well as to get a picture of the needs of our artists of color across the country. The advisory committee included members of NASOs and ASOs, so art service organizations, both national and regional. The key point, the report reflects an online survey that went out in February in both English and French, over 1,150 respondents. We have kept it open, and I think it's over 1,300 now, just about, or about 1,300. We also held focus groups in Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal, and Vancouver, with primarily to meet with NASOs and ASOs. And interviews with Francophone organizations in Quebec were also conducted. We did extensive research, which included a systematic review of available resources in all provinces and territories, including Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Our key point is to say that legal issues touch on all aspects of an artist's practice and require specialized understanding of the sector. However, Canadian artists' earnings continue to hover at poverty levels. Specialized legal services are beyond most artists' reach, a situation dramatically worsened by COVID-19. And I just want to speak briefly about COVID. Obviously, I don't have to say this to anyone on this discussion. It's having a catastrophic impact on the Canadian arts sector, worsening what we know are artists' already precarious living conditions and increasing the urgency of their legal needs. While much of it is anecdotal at this point, we know that from our work, particularly PLEO, that contracts, cancellations, employment, and not surprisingly, the biggest issue that we've been dealing with has been commercial rent relief, commercial tenancy issues that have arisen. They're being reported most frequently. Artists left out in the cold because a gallery is closed because it can't pay its rent as well. So we've done, I think, 13 webinars in the last 2 months. Over 500 organizations have participated. Yesterday, we had 600 registered for a talk about virtual AGMs, everybody's favorite exciting experience in the nonprofit sector, I'm sure. And just to give you an example of what we've been dealing with in the past couple of weeks, we are getting a pro bono lawyer to meet with 50 artists who've been evicted as a consequence of their, not the owner of the building, but their landlord effectively deciding as a result of COVID that they weren't going to continue to operate the business, and with basically 30 days notice. And they were fully paid up in rent as well. We've also been able to get a lawyer involved in another arts nonprofit that was dealing with damage to the premises just as the pandemic called for the closure of all facilities. And we've been providing summary legal advice to artists affected by the closures of galleries and art spaces in the city of Vancouver. So the need is urgent and real. Our report effectively concludes that a national network of legal clinics for the arts would enable us to leverage what we're doing across the country and start filling gaps in areas that don't currently have a legal clinic. We are in the process of a strategic initiative grant application to Canadian Heritage and having a grant to sector innovation at the Canada Council for the Arts. We're also going to be engaging over the next couple of weeks in what can probably be framed as very serious political advocacy, because we know that the federal government has funded innovation clinics ostensibly to meet the needs of innovators across the country. And we know that those millions of dollars that were made available to do that indicate to us that there's funding available to support creators who are the major innovators in our country, in my opinion. That's the pitch, anyway. We are hoping that by working together as a national network, that we can better meet the needs of artists and arts organizations across the country, and that we can empower artists in ways that will set them in good stead for whatever their needs are moving forward. In terms of the actual survey, we had 1,154 respondents. That's the report number. And from priority groups were identified as Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, racialized, LGBTQ, deaf, disabled, and mental health challenges. Of artists, 38% of the total number of artists self-identified as belonging to a priority group. 62% did not provide a response. In terms of organizations, 61% of the total number of organizations self-identified as providing services specific to and or accessible to a priority group. These are good numbers from the point of view of the priority groups as aspects of the total population. We know our work in Vancouver in particular, in preparation for an application to the City of Vancouver, we actually reviewed all of our client files going back 15 years, and we discovered that 50% of all of our arts organization clients were from priority groups, and that in Vancouver alone, 50% of urban Indigenous serving nonprofits had attended our workshops, which is more than any other organization providing legal education in BC, period. And what that tells me is that we're reaching people who do not have access to justice. And one of our theories, we've been speaking to people about this, is that, you know, when you don't have anything you're not used to, you've been shut out of a system for whatever series of reasons, Google searches are your friend. And people have found us because we've been focused on reaching communities and making what we're doing as accessible as possible. I like to think that it's sort of working, but like Charles, if we had even a fraction of what some of the major arts service organizations in this country had, we would be able to do that much more. We get no provincial funding, none, bupkis. Zero. We get no provincial funding from Law Foundation funding, and we get no provincial funding from the government, despite having access to justice as one of its tenets. I would suggest to you that, you know, many of you are in Ontario, where there's 93 community legal aid clinics. In BC, there's 7. And they are, after 16 years of austerity under the so-called Liberal government, really, you know, they can't be expected to meet more needs. So I hear what you were saying, Charles, because I think that until access to justice, which disproportionately impacts people of color, is addressed, we're going to continue to be continually fighting for redistributive justice. So another interesting statistic from the report was that many artists are not members of an arts service organization and are not well informed about legal services that might be offered by some of the arts service organizations across the country. And that those numbers were even higher among racialized artists. And I had a funny experience at the Writers Union Conference a couple of years ago in Vancouver, where there were a lot of Indigenous and racialized writers there who basically said, we're not members of the Writers Union. So we don't qualify for membership because we haven't published in the forms that you recognize as qualifying us for membership. And there was a lot of conversations in the hallways about how do we better meet the needs of people who are already shut out of art service organizations like the union, which I know is changing and doing things since those conversations in Vancouver.
Martha, you've got a minute. If you can, Martha.
Okay. This is the last slide from the report, which is that there are substantial unmet needs for legal services in the Canadian arts and culture sector. People are unaware of what is available and know more now. And there's an urgent need for geographic expansion of existing services across the country, from coast to coast to coast. And we hope this time next year we'll be in the midst of expanding the availability and accessibility of legal services to the arts across the country. So, questions? Oh, come on now.
If people have questions, you type them into the chat box and then Kevin will relay them to Martha. Seeing no questions at this point.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
So, I'll ask a question and maybe people can respond in the chat function. I'd like to know if any of you actually got the survey and filled it out. And this just as a matter of curiosity. And I guess by extension, for those of you who are hearing about these legal clinics for the first, is this the first time that you're hearing that there's a legal clinic in Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver? So
those answers, you can just type them into the chat box and we can relay them on to Martha.
That would be great.
That'd be great. Thank you, Martha. And obviously we'll be working on this as we go forward.
Great.
Our next speaker is Alica. Are you still here? Martha, you have to take away your chat screen or your share screen.
Oh, right.
Okay,
yes, sorry.
No problem.
Thank you.
There we go. Alica, you're here. Are you okay to go now, Alica? You're muted.
Yeah, I'm just gonna switch to my phone actually because my computer's acting funny and dying for some reason quickly.
Yep.
So I don't know if you want to go to the next speaker or if I can just call back.
Okay. If we can, Kristina, is okay if you go next, then we can have Alica so she makes that transition.
So I can also offer some responses in the chat that's coming from the question that Martha posed. You see here, yes, it's the first time we've heard about the clinic. We see some, April mentioning, yes, received it and participated. I'm the co-founder of one of the clinics and we refer visual artists to them a lot. And many other responses are saying, yes, they filled it out. Someone is also saying they did not get the survey and was not aware of the LS clinic in Toronto.
Thank you. Kristina, are you okay to go?
Yeah, I can certainly get going. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as you know, my name is Kristina Lemieux, she, her. I am a settler on these lands, both in terms of where my people come from, also in terms of the choices I have made as an adult. In my over 20-year-long history in the arts, I have worked in Edmonton, Vancouver, and now Toronto. And I hold two formal leadership roles in the arts. I am the lead producer of Generator here in Toronto and the producer of Form in Vancouver. In my work in the arts, I work with performing artists, so theater, dance, staged music, who largely work independently from institutions and are generally interested in producing their own work. Now, that desire may come from a place of self-determination, and it also can come from a place of being excluded from those institutions, and also from places that I can't imagine and may never know. But I want to talk about a few things that I know and some questions I have in this time. Before I start, I also just want to be really clear that when I'm using the word artist, I use it as a stand-in for the performers, the stage managers, the lighting designers, the producers, the production managers, the set designers, and all these other fee-based roles that are required to put a performance up and make it a production. And for context, I am largely talking about productions with a total budget of under $100,000. And for a production that size, that group may hire up to 15 people, most of whom are getting a fee of less than $2,000 for about 6 weeks of work or so, intermittent, and is generally not full-time work. So some of the things I know is that being on CERB is the most stable the artists I work with have been in their careers. These are largely artists living in Toronto and Vancouver, both cities that are often on the most expensive cities in the world lists. So let's think about that. So $2,000 a month is the most stable an artist has been who lives in Toronto and Vancouver. And these are cities in which the rent, our average rent for one bedroom is $2,000. And I also want to point out for those of you who haven't been following closely, or don't know what's going on, CERB only offers $2,000 a month for a maximum of 16 weeks or 4 months. So if you applied for CERB when it was first released, you have now applied for your last set of weeks. Meaning come in July, if you haven't found other work, you are facing a really scary summer. And these artists that we work with work in a variety of capacities. And like, think back to what I said a minute ago. These artists are getting paid around $2,000 a month, $2,000 for a production, $3,000. They're doing 2 or 3 of those a year. So when we're talking about how much artists are making in a year, we're not talking about the majority of their income coming from their art practice. So it's coming from their other work, their non-arts work, their Joe jobs, which could be serving, coffee shops, theater after school programs, voice lessons, producing or admin work in other companies. All of that work is still not returning in a regular, normal way, and the $2,000 a month CERB is coming to an end. So we have another giant crisis coming in the arts in the next couple of weeks. At the same time as all this is happening, operatingly funded arts organizations are being told to survive, do less, plan, and sustain. When the lockdown hit, the shows that were postponed or canceled were often able to pay out those artists. But there's been little transparency on what's going to happen in the coming months and years. I just want to give like some really solid examples of what I mean when I'm saying this. So if we look at the Canada Council for the Arts, what's happened in the last little while is that core-funded organizations were given the equivalent of 35% of their annual grant in their bank, no questions asked, in early May. And then last week, the COVID-19 Emergency Support Fund gave those same organizations 25% of their 2021 core grant with no application or no assessment to maintain jobs, support business continuity for organizations, and stabilize the arts sector. And the only requirement for that was that you could show a loss of 25% in 3 months since COVID in comparison to 3 months in the previous year, which was a very loose definition. At the same time, artists are being asked to either keep their project funds and retain them for a future project or return the money that was unspent via a formula. At the Toronto Arts Council, organizations and collectives could postpone or adjust projects without penalty, or organizations receiving core funding were not required to have replacement programming for events or activities that were delayed, changed, or canceled. In the same time, artists are basically told to contact our officers, although I will say that was largely a positive experience for most artists with the Toronto Arts Council. In addition, what we've also seen in Toronto is that 80 organizations are the recipient of $1 million donation towards COVID-19 efforts through the Hal Jackman Foundation, which was administered by the Toronto Arts Foundation. And these funds were unrestricted. And in the words of Victoria Jackman, investment is essential to ensure that Torontonians have a strong arts programming to return to after the crisis. And my question with all of this is, how is that money getting to these artists? Now, I will acknowledge that there are challenges to this question. As charities and nonprofits, it's difficult to give away free money. So the question has come down to, how do we make that a transaction in which there's a product at the end? At the same time, I want us to all get a bit more creative about what we can do to redistribute the funds that we have and support artists who are going through critical times now, in this moment, and going forward for an indeterminate amount of time. In addition, we're also just not accounting for the opportunity lost to the artists who had not been hired for shows that were going to happen and could have reliably assumed that their schedule would have been filled out for the next year by now. Looking back again to like what artists are being asked to do in terms of productivity, what we're seeing is operating clients asking artists to help them create content through digital means. Maybe artists have the capacity to do that, but I do have questions about whether or not artists have the technical equipment, from computers to lights to mics, and whether or not they have the skills to do that work. And if they are interested in it, who's investing in them and the time it will take them to develop those skills so that they can participate in this new digital world. Additionally, I'm just seeing and disappointed in the way in which those digital funds are being administered. They often have short turnaround times from the fund being announced to when the application is due. Often the application is far more complex than it perhaps needs to be. And the fees don't reflect the time and skill growth required to deliver a product that many artists don't have the immediate ability to use. So what I'm asking again for organizations is to create opportunities for artists to engage with the public that give them the tools that they need, and or create opportunities for artists to be in rest and sustaining and creativity time that doesn't have a product at the end of what's going to happen. And if you're an artist who's working right now, know that operatingly funded institutions are being funded to maintain activity in a way, and it is within your rights as someone connected to those institutions to ask them what they're doing to support artists during this time. I also just want to give a shout out or an acknowledgement to that in this moment that we're in, more specifically within COVID, that artists who are sitting at home are watching all these solidarity statements that speak in opposition to their own experiences working with those organizations, and organizations that continue to uphold settler colonial white supremacist values and continue to benefit off of the knowledges of IBPOC artists, and continue to be asked by them to teach us how they have been harmed, overlooked, and undervalued. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, please check out hashtags like In the Dressing Room and a variety of Facebook groups like I Lost My Gig and Canadian Theatre Anti-Racist Exchange. Now, the point of this talk was specifically to be looking at arts administration. So I want to talk a little bit about like some of the discrepancy in like what my career as an arts manager is. So after my 20 years career in the arts, I have been able to experience and I also want to, within this, acknowledge my social location and my high privilege that comes in like that social location in going through this list. But after 20 years of working in the arts, I tend to work for organizations that are more stable because they have operating funding and loyal donor bases. My access to stable income and paid vacation and health benefits increase. I can expect to be paid a higher hourly rate as an administrator than an artist with the same years of experience. I have access to the benefits of labor movements like weekends, holidays, hours of work, overtime, and employment law and the organization I work for is likely to be within those standards. And if they're not, there are ways for me to have recourse to that. I get invited to speak at conversations like this, where I'm asked to reflect on what's best, possible, and next for the sector. And basically, the longer I work in the arts as an administrator, the further I get from precarity I am within the arts. So that leads me to a bunch of questions right now about what it means to be in arts management. How do we unsettle ourselves? How do we undivide, or how do we bring together this idea of arts in administration? The dividing these two has meant that like what artist success looks like is 100% of their time in a creation mode. It leads to stories of artists being bad at business, stories that art success looks like artists being starving, and that admin is less desirable work and therefore overvalued with compensation. I want to see a world in which this idea of arts and admin come together in a way that allows artists to be in control of their means of production and able to sustain their lives outside of just creation. We also, to do with this, I think we need to do away and break up with ideas like best practices and like the right way to do things. Although please do not send a poem to the CRA for your taxes. This is the one part in arts management where we can't get away from it, is you still have to talk to the CRA in their language, but you can create a contract that reflects your values. So the questions I have going forward is how do we develop systems that support all of us and create value for artists in a way that is putting them at the center of all the work we're doing. That's all my time.
Thank you, Kristina.
All right, we have a question, and the question was off the bat. Give me 1 second here. Given the ending of CERB for most artists, who is advocating to have, if anyone, or if anyone you know of, is advocating to have the time period extended?
That is a really great question and something I am worried about and working on. So I will put in the chat there, both Canadian Actors Equity and ACTRA have a really template letter that you can use if you're an artist, as well as like an easy link to your MP. and Generator will be posting that on some other resources in the next couple of days or early next week. But I was sort of even looking through the groups that started around to support the hospitality industry to wonder what they were doing about it. And it's really fallen to an advocacy background. I'm not seeing a lot of folks doing that work.
There was also another comment here that CARFAC is planning to do the same. So maybe there's potential collaboration and partnerships amongst organizations that's possible.
Canadian Arts Coalition did also put out a statement yesterday about the extension of CERB.
Great.
Sorry, Kevin, was there another question?
Another question here. How does Kristina assist emerging artists who have come to the arts later in their career, or do?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't know that, like, speaking specifically to my work at Generator, I don't know that we would necessarily use the term emerging artist. We work with artists who are like at this really sort of hard to identify and sweet spot of their career, where like you have done some producing of your own work, but are not too comfortable in it. And so like we're looking for people who have tried a little bit and need the skills to sort of accelerate their careers going forward. And that's just about like a pedagogical choice of not wanting to be starting education from I've never seen a budget before versus I've tried a budget and I didn't really know what I was doing. That said, there is no age basis on what we're doing. And if you haven't seen it already, and I can also put this in the chat, there's artistproducerresource.com, which is a wiki textbook style piece of information, again, looking at various tools and information about how to produce work. Again, based in performance.
Sorry, Kristina. Another follow-up to that. Whoa, popular. Kristina, you're popular here. Another follow-up to that is what types of skills specifically? I think you just mentioned that. And does she assist with training? I'm not quite sure if the person might want to expound on that some more in terms of what you mean by training, given the sort of work that she does at the Generator that she explained. So if you have a message around a response to that, I'll take it later. I'm going to move on. This is a comment. I'm in the reverse role, having worked as an arts manager and now primarily as an artist. I see the display so much more. Thank you for sharing, Kristina. The response to the training components was an exhibition.
Like, do we train people? Yeah, I mean, so much of what we do at Generator like applies. Like a budget is a budget. Writing a grant or like how to put together a clear articulation of an idea is the same. But once you get to distribution of your art, like there are significant enough differences between visual arts and performance that we tend to like not be able to serve both well. I'm just trying to think if there's anyone. I mean, CARFAC, honestly, I'm on CARFAC all the time. I use their fees and rate schedules and their various pieces that they do around labor and translate that into my work in film and also work in performance. So like, if you're in that vein, and I would be leaning on CARFAC. They do great work.
He said, thank you.
I think we'll need to move on, Kevin.
Let's move on.
That's
yeah.
Okay. So if there are other questions for Kristina, we'll get them to her and we can get the answer back. Thank you, Kristina. Alica, have you rejoined us? Alica? No.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Charles, can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry, Yep. I can go. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I had to come off of computer, so I'm calling in. My name is Alica, and I work with Mia Center for the Arts. As an organization, a bit of background about us: we have a mission to support, showcase, and promote an appreciation of the arts from across the African diaspora. We were started 10 years ago, and originally conceived of as a physical space to address the lack of places for Black artists to showcase their work and for Black Canadian communities to gather, recognizing that Black artists are very well represented in a variety of disciplines, but particularly in major urban centers like Toronto, which is home to the largest community of Black folks, there isn't spaces that are dedicated to supporting, uplifting, and showcasing the work of Black artists. So we started out primarily working with youth who are interested in the arts, and then have gone on to focus on supporting as well emerging artists, offering professional development, residencies, training, in a range of disciplines. And we've also presented exhibitions, performances, and artistic experiences as a way to both create opportunities for our own community to experience narratives that represent our experiences as Black Canadians, as well as supporting the diversification of art that makes up the artistic experience in the Canadian landscape. So this working relationship that we have with artists has given us insight into their needs and experiences. As has been mentioned, precarity is inextricably linked to the arts sector. However, it is amplified in its impact for Black folks in particular, who are already precarious due to marginalization and racism. So what we saw before COVID, I think it's important to note some of the trends that we were seeing in advance of the onset of this pandemic, because these trends are just amplified during the pandemic. So what we've noted is Black artists are more likely to be self-taught and exist outside of the mainstream arts ecosystem. That is, they receive fewer opportunities to exhibit, present, and perform. As Charles has noted, they have historically been underfunded by all councils, both at an individual and organizational level. I believe we're the only Black organization that's funded within our stream through the Toronto Arts Council, and I think one of only 3 in the entire TAC portfolio. A recent brief survey of 18 commercial galleries by artist Ibrahim Abusida noted that of the artists that these galleries represent, 2% were Black and less than 1% were Indigenous. These challenges are born out of a repeated denial of Black artistic production as professional and commercially viable. This is what anti-Black racism looks like in the arts. As an organization that both supports and showcases artists, we rely on the labor and leadership of organizations like SAPAMO and leaders like Charles and Kevin to be able to collate trends and data, as we find that institutions and other organizations rarely collect this data. I think one of the criticisms of the Canadian arts sector in general is that there isn't enough research specifically on the representation of Black and racialized and Indigenous bodies. And so when we think about the American situation as dire and challenging as it is, they often have a lot more data in a variety of sectors that highlights the ways in which Black people experience inequity. And so from the limited data that we do have, Charles's recent research gave us a lot of insight into the experiences of Black and racialized artists, that over the years there's been a decrease in their income, which already in a city like Toronto that has really persistent and high costs of living makes their ability to live and pursue a viable career as an artist very difficult. Artists are doing temporary low-wage work and are more likely to be unemployed, and really have said to us they find it difficult to make a living from their practice, to find spaces that are safe and consistent to produce and create work, and of course I spoke earlier to the opportunities to showcase their work. All of that against the backdrop now of COVID-19. We sent out a survey in early April, some of our members and stakeholders following the lockdown, to get a sense of the impact on their financial, mental well-being, their ability to sort of move forward in their careers, and generally get a sense of how we could better support them. So we had a number of artists respond who were working in theater and performing arts, media art, music, visual art, and writers, and some quotes about what they had to say about how COVID-19 had impacted their lives. All of my arts education contracts have been canceled, my dance project is interrupted, summer visual arts residency canceled, and I have no income to support my dependent. Another quote, earning potential has shifted. I have to figure out how to earn a living online. That takes time, and during that learning curve, my income has been split in half. Another quote, all of my performance opportunities have ceased, and even my personal rehearsal space I rent out to other local musicians has had to stop operating. At the time of the survey, 35 of respondents said they had lost over $3,000 in income. What was also communicated was a sense of loss as it relates to the potential of opportunities, as well as the loss of momentum from the sudden stop in production. There was a lot of folks who talked about the connections that they were making, the talks that they were having with either, galleries or institutions, and the sense that they were hesitant now about whether or not they should even invest time and energy into new or existing artistic initiatives. The impact on arts administration. As an organization, NIA Center is embarking on an ambitious capital project. We have a space in Toronto, just south of Eglinton West, that we're working to transform into Canada's first professional multidisciplinary center that's dedicated to Afro-diasporic art. The pandemic has thrown this project in a precarious state as construction was shut down. It's also brought into question our ability to raise additional funds from the private sector and donors to support the completion of the project. As an arts organization, folks always talk about diverse streams of revenue being the goal, but ultimately for a smaller, emerging Black arts organization, our ability to secure revenue from private donors is difficult, given that we don't have these historical networks of folks who have the kind of capital to be able to support us. And there's not always that interest as well. We're not the kind of folks who are going to collect work from individuals that, people have seen in existing galleries or the AGO already. And so there's the sense that what we're doing doesn't really matter and isn't commercially viable. And so, as an arts organization, thinking about the viability of our space and sustaining it once it's even completed is also thrown into question. I know for many of our colleagues who have spaces already, they're already currently financially challenged, given that they have significant overhead costs. But as we work to build this important space for our community, for our city, and for Canada as a whole, we now have to consider that the viability of the model as a whole is put into question. And so as an organization, we've had to pivot and look at how we can support artists through this period, and whether that's helping them understand some of these services and supports that are currently available through them, whether it's funding opportunities or CERB or other government initiatives, as well as creating opportunities for folks to gather and just share how they're feeling and what's needed. A lot of folks did talk about the wanting to learn how to move their services and their practice online, but also noted the kind of, learning curve and energy that takes, and that being on sort of an accelerated timeline. So we've sought to partner with artists at this time for those who are, interested in working or who have ideas and want to present, and create opportunities for them to do so. I think post-pandemic, some of the things that we're learning through this is that we need a greater shared commitment to recognize, value, and support Black artists and Black artistic traditions. We need that commitment across councils. We need that commitment in the private sector and among private donors, and amongst our peers in the arts ecosystem here in Toronto and across the country. We also need access to disaggregated data. We've seen across, industries, whether it be employment, private sector, housing, we don't have a clear understanding or picture of how, racism and marginalization specifically impact Black people, and access to that data allows us to pinpoint solutions that will move us forward. We need art that is rooted in building and reflecting our society and propels critical dialogue around the issues that matter most. And we do need to continue to build capacity to create and produce in a digital space in a way that still allows artists to, rest, as well as, think about their practices without it being dependent on that transition to a digital space. And I know we'll talk about this more further later on, but we need to fight for livable wages, including a guaranteed livable income. That's all for me. Any questions?
Is there any questions for Alica? Again, if you are asking a question so that everyone can see it, we're suggesting you put it in the everyone rather than sending it to me.
If no questions at this time, we'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Alica. And as you see, we're getting into some of the larger issues, into community specific. So our next speaker, which I think will be a bit more of the broader, is Kehinde. working on the Artist Income Precarity project out of WorkinCulture. Kehinde, over to you.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm addressing the broader. I can only address what we've been working on. So, okay, so I think a couple of years ago, Ontario Trillium Foundation brought together a bunch of different groups and individuals to speak specifically around income precarity for in the art sector. And I wasn't there yet, but the discussion that they had seemed to be one where there seemed to be some momentum to look at ways of addressing income precarity. So what ended up happening was a group was formed, a smaller group was formed to look at the issue. They received funding from OTF under their collective impact program. I don't think it still exists, but WorkinCulture was the lead organization. So at the point where they brought me in last year, they were just embarking on the actual research itself, and basically commissioned a jurisdictional scan of what are just different types of policies and initiatives that are being done globally, looking at, different places and, what's been effective in their areas. And, hi, Judy. And hi, April, still. Shout out to both of you. So once they brought folks together and started to do this research, we looked at, the work being done in Quebec, policy-wise, and in terms of some of the tax benefits. We looked, I believe it's Denmark. Basically, just hands a check. If if you go to art school, you finish art school, you are now able to get a stipend from the government month to month. And as you start to find work, you start to kind of, transition off of those payments. There's also work being done in New Zealand and elsewhere around resale royalty fees. So, and this is an area that is particularly beneficial to Aboriginal communities, where you sell some work, you sell it at a low amount, and then that work, then starts to gain notoriety or become more popular. The value goes up. The person who bought it from you is now able to resell it at higher fees, make a profit, and the originators of the work get nothing, so that's something that is being looked at, I believe, at the World Trade Organization. It is an international issue. But we kind of, to keep it real, we looked at the solutions or the potential things to emulate around on the table. A lot of them were kind of dictated by government having to take it up and make it policy. And looking from an Ontario perspective, that given that is our original scope, we just felt like, we don't think we're going to convince a conservative government to take up a lot of these things. So then we started to look at a model called SMART. It is based out of Belgium. It's in several countries across Europe. But basically what it is it's a platform co-op. So if everyone's familiar with what a cooperative is or a workers' cooperative is, it's basically the same thing. It was formed by artists, I want to say 13 or 14 years ago. And they basically, the first things that they had it serve was to address the administration and the types of, every artist, every self-employed person has to handle a whole bunch of their own kind of administrative stuff in the back end. And so they were able to sort of like pool their resources, have someone who's able to like keep track of their expenses, their invoicing, you know, their bookkeeping, helping them, you know, make sure all their stuff, all their shit is aligned for their taxes, and so that they'll be able to get whatever benefits come their way. But as they grew, they were able to sort of incorporate even more services. So those things look like legal advice, particularly when working with employers. They're able to have insurance. A lot of freelancers, a lot of self-employed people generally don't have insurance. And if you're an artist, it can really depend the type of insurance that you're able to get and the types of rates that you gotta pay. Like, imagine being a fire breather in this economy. Yee, you know what I mean? So being able to like be on a group insurance plan kind of brings down the rate for everyone. And they've actually saved a lot of money doing that. And then things just like training. In some of the spaces, they are able to do to provide workspaces and to do promotion of the artists, like particularly the visual artists, of their work and helping it get kind of sold or find its way to market. And as they grew, like I said, like it started with artists, but it grew into all types of freelancers. And so we kind of looked at it, and it was the most impressive to us simply because, how should I put it? The onus was not on getting the government to do something. It was communities of artists kind of addressing their own needs by collective action. And as we went along, and the more that I've looked into it, like platform co-ops is a real thing. It's a really growing area. There's a lot of examples at local levels. There, for example, out in BC, I believe it's called Stocksy, and it's a bunch of different photographers who basically created their own platform for stock imaging, and to be able to sell things out of that, like one website. We actually did a gathering back in March, the early part of March, where we brought some folks from BC, from a place called Value Co-op, which is a bit different, but they are another example of they're basically a cooperative of printers, print artists, and that they find ways to secure different contracts and make sure that the folks that are kind of most in need, they prioritize people of color, indigenous people, to be able to get work. And everyone has a voice, everyone has a vote in terms of determining how they, decisions they make, how they move forward. The SMART model is great. There's a lot of differences though between here and Europe, but we, as a result of the research and some of the consulting in the community, and talking to experts and bringing together some of those folks in that gathering in March, we decided, you know what, let's try to see if we can't explore a pilot. Let's see if we can try to set something up here, and we're still working on how that's gonna roll out. But I can tell you that right now we are working with OCAD, as well as the Ontario Cooperative Association. You know, these are folks that really know their stuff. We're still in the process of applying for grants to be able to get the pilot resource. But the idea is, and we are kind of more, I would say, more focused on visual artists, but we want this to be something that can be open to everyone. However, we want to start with a small group of artists that have enough of a diversity around the table to, kind of get the ball rolling, set up like how they would like it to be structured, how they would like it to be governed, and what out of the different services they would need to prioritize. I recognize that it's not ultimately, and maybe this is more my own personal opinion, but when it comes to precarity for artists, and especially income precarity for artists, something like CERB, the universal basic income, if you want to call it that, that's just what needs to be there. Like, it just needs to be there for all Canadians, especially all Canadians that really need it, that face any type of precarity. Anyone who's working freelance, anyone who's working, but in the meantime, being able to set up our own organizations where we own, to use the, I guess the lefty term, we own the means of production, and we're able to share in that and then benefit everyone in the group is kind of what we're looking at. And I think for me, kind of informs the work. So right now, between now and September, we're looking for folks who are interested in participating. I would say personally that I am prioritizing Black people and queer people to participate. But we're working also with Arts Pond. Arts Pond has been working on developing sort of the tech for a platform like this, and finding a way to be able to use digital tools to, make it all work. And so they're going to be nominating some folks to bring to the table. But ultimately, we really would like to make the work and the lives of artists, in particular practicing artists, a little easier. And hopefully from this pilot, we would be able to expand out into other areas in terms of being able to also be able to support like just plain freelancers. I mean, the reality is that a lot of artists don't get all of their money from doing art, and it can be a struggle to sort of pull everything together, as far as like your paperwork, your tax information, and all of that sort of stuff. We want to be able to serve you, and we want this to kind of transition into something that is owned by the community itself. I don't know if I should add any more.
Thank you. Turn over to Kevin, see if you have questions.
All right. Thank you, Kehinde. Any questions?
If there are people that are interested in finding out more, you can definitely email me. Is there a way for me to leave my email in the chat, or is
Yes, you can. Yeah, you can, Kehinde.
Do that. All right, cool. I'll do that.
Thank you very much, Kehinde, and Alica. So I'm going to move to the other side of the country right now, and that's Brenda Ledley, the BC Alliance for the Arts, and also a co-member on the Canadian Arts Coalition. I say co with me on the Canadian Arts Coalition. Brenda, over to you.
Thanks so much, Charles. I'm really honored to be invited to speak today. This is such a time of challenge and change for all of us. And I think all of us are experiencing a lot of anxiety about not knowing what the future holds. I know for myself personally, I'm actually having to get up in the morning and do yoga and meditate before I start my work day, because by the time I'm about an hour into it, I start to feel the stress and the pressure of having to make decisions about what I'm going to do and how I'm going to try to advocate on behalf of the sector here in British Columbia. The BC Alliance is an organization that's been around for almost 35 years. Its main focus is arts advocacy, and it has a membership that is quite large, or almost 500 members, most of them from the Lower Mainland in Greater Vancouver. And slowly we're growing out as we've become more of a provincial arts service organization. So during this time, one of the things that I have really focused on is to look at what the opportunities are for us now. I think that it's exciting that we're in this shifting time, that there are possibilities for change, for systemic change that I think is absolutely necessary in order for our Earth, our planet, our civilization to evolve. We've really seen, I think, with climate change and with the COVID crisis, that the current system of economic growth and capitalism isn't really working. And so we need to think about how we can change things now. And that's what keeps me awake at night, is thinking, how am I gonna do this? How are we gonna do this together? Because really it is about doing it together. That's really the only way it can work. I see that people are staying home now, with the COVID situation, and they've reconnected with being at home and with their families. And as difficult sometimes as that can be, I think what it's really done also is it's made us really re-examine what our values are and what's important to us. And I think this is really at the heart of the changes that we need to see, is that we need to think about what the values are that we want to live, how we want to live, and how we want our sector to proceed in these times of opportunity. I think the first thing we really need to do is we need to acknowledge that we're living in a colonial system that hasn't changed for a very long time. And so, the inequity of our sector just as a whole to start with. I mean, I've been working in the arts for over 40 years. I've been an artist. I've done everything. And now I'm an advocate. But one of the things that I see is that our sector, arts, culture, heritage, has never really been seen as an essential service. As much as we think that we are contributing significantly to society, there's a very large percentage of the people who don't see us that way. They see us as a frill. Some people see us as elitist, as entitled. I learned that when I started working in this position, when I was trying to figure out what was the best way to advocate for the arts here in British Columbia. And so then I started to realize that, that was the reality, that people saw us a particular way. And so my focus then became, well, how do we change that? How do we change that idea, that perception of the arts in people's minds? I started looking at research that was going on in the UK and other parts, Australia, and I started to see that there was this real idea of the arts bringing us together, connecting us, and that's what was essential. Connection is essential for our well-being and for our health, our mental health, our physical health. And I started to see people who were doing things with creativity and art that were affecting change in people with Alzheimer's, in youth at risk, in people living in poverty, in people who were homeless. And I started to really expand my opinion about what it was that the arts are and what they can mean to society. And so I very much started to promote this idea of the connection between arts, creativity, and well-being. And that has been our advocacy strategy for the past couple of years. And it's quite broad, and it's quite inclusive. And we are seeing a lot of support for the idea here in British Columbia, and even now across the country. This idea is starting to grow. I think it's really important in this time of COVID that the arts are relevant. because people are really hurting and struggling. And so we need to be relevant, and we need to be serving our community, because ultimately that is our role, is to serve our community. That's why we exist. That's why we create our art, to, you know, share our stories, to give people a glimpse of what it's like for everybody, whether you're you know, a person of color, an Indigenous person, a person living with a disability. You know, we need to hear those stories. The BC Alliance for the past 4 years has really been focused on inclusion and on making sure that when we have a conference or we have an event, that we have voices that are not heard. So whether they're Indigenous, whether they're people of color, whether they're disabled, whether they're deaf artists, we've really tried to break open the definition of what we mean by the professional arts to include every voice, and more so all the time. I think that there is a huge problem with our funding systems, obviously. They are very much steeped in colonialism, particularly the Canada Council, all of them are steeped in colonialism, and we see that in the way that they talk about how they're going to support BIPOC artists, but then they don't actually do it. The fact that many BIPOC artists are still on project grants and can't access operating grants. The fact that the juries are secret. You know, they're not allowed to say who's on the juries. I've always questioned that and wondered, why can't we be open? Why can't we be transparent about it? There's a lot of work that needs to be done in our sector to decolonize ourselves. It's not an easy process. I've been working with Indigenous artists since the early 90s, and I am still seeing parts of myself that are colonized, and they're not seeing the situation for Indigenous artists the way that I need to see them. And I'm still really much learning, and I've gone through years and years of trying to identify what part of me is racist, what part of me is colonized and isn't seeing it because I've been brainwashed. So I think it's up to every one of us as Canadians, as artists, to make sure that we are really looking closely at how we are contributing to the colonialist values and views that are rampant in our society. I think the more that we can embrace decolonization, the more our eyes will be open to see that we are all humans, and we are all of value. Every life counts, and Black lives matter, and Indigenous lives matter, and racialized artists need to be supported. I think one of the first things we could do is we could give Indigenous or BIPOC artists the opportunity to be leaders, because we really need your voices now. More than anything, we need the voices of BIPOC artists. We need to step aside, to offer leadership positions in arts organizations. We need to learn. Last year, we did a conference called Weaving Wellness, and we invited an Indigenous artist, Lisa Cook-Ravensbergen, to be the curator of that event, to show the connection between well-being and creativity and art from an Indigenous perspective. And my staff and I and several other collaborators went through a process with Lisa that was really enlightening, and it completely changed the way our relationships with each other, so that now the way we operate in our office is about mutual respect, caring. We're very open with each other now. There's much more collaborative decision making, and it's really been a fantastic experience, just because we stepped aside for a moment and let someone else come in and show us the way. It was so valuable. So there needs to be a lot more of that. And what's happening at the BC Alliance in terms of advocacy is that we began when this started by hosting weekly meetings with all the arts service organizations in British Columbia. And that was really remarkable because we have never come together as a sector and shared and talked and worked together. We came to those meetings with open hearts. We talked about what our challenges were, and then slowly those meetings evolved. And now what happens is we talk about specific things that we have learned, and we have guests. Our guests frequently are people who is the executive director of the BC Arts Council and works very closely with the Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture. So we have had a very transparent relationship with government through this, and we are working with them together to help our sector. So one of the first things they asked us to do was to create an impact survey. So Kenji Maeda from the Greater Vancouver Professional Theatre Alliance stepped up to the plate and has created this amazing survey, which the government is using to track the financial and also the emotional, I would say, impact of the COVID virus on the artists in British Columbia. We've also been collaborating with all kinds of different groups. And as you know, it's happening all across the country. The NASOs are having meetings. The PACT people are having meetings. There's more collaboration now than I have ever seen before. And we speak about it often, and we speak about how important it will be to continue that kind of collaboration and that kind of sharing as we move forward. And even the government has remarked that they're really surprised to see how our sector has really coalesced and started to work together. So we have presentations to the Finance Committee coming up next week, and we will make presentations, and those of us who are coming from arts and culture are talking and making sure that our presentations, that we're speaking with one voice, that we're asking for the same thing, that our priorities are the same. And our priorities are all about supporting BIPOC artists and organizations, all about supporting people in the regions, in the rural areas, all about supporting creativity and innovation, and basically thinking about a holistic way to support the arts. I have to agree that I think redistributive justice, I love that terminology. I think it's timely. I think there's a need for arts organizations to change. We're also diving into some research. We have a MyTAC grant. We're going to look at the impact of COVID on people's participation in the arts and creative activity to sort of see how that measures. And because we think that since people have been isolated, they've actually been more engaged in the arts, whether they're online, whether they're, you know, doing creative activities with their children, whether they're baking bread. People are doing things now and being more creative than they have been before. And we think it's an opportune time to talk about that and to say, what would have happened in these times of isolation if people didn't have the arts? What would they be doing? We think that there'd be a lot more people with mental health issues. I mean, there already are, but you know, we think it's helped a lot, and we want the government to recognize the contribution the arts has made during this time of COVID to prove our worth, really. Again, it's about the value of what we bring to society, to community, has never really been understood. And so it's really, I think, our job and our opportunity now to make sure we get that message out, that we are contributing in a really significant way to the well-being, to the mental health, to all of the things that are so important, the values that are important. And when we make our presentations to the Finance Committee, we'll be talking about values, and we'll be talking about how we serve people and how we think investing in people and not profit is the only way we can move forward. So we are, we're very saddened to hear today that there's been this, I don't know if you've heard, but this announcement by the many national media organizations that they're not going to make the arts, they're not going to be covering the arts, they're going to be covering other things. I think that there's an opportunity there for us to speak out and say, this is not the time to abandon the arts. This is when we need the media to understand and to be educated about our importance. It's really important. I think that We need to be seen as an essential service.
You got 1 more minute, if you can do that.
I'm finished. I can't believe I talked that long. I didn't think I'd be able to even fill 5 minutes, but I got going. And so there I am blathering away. But I really think that we are an essential service, and we know that. And above all else, now in this time of Black Lives Matter, we have an opportunity to step up to the plate and to make policies for our organizations. We need to have direct action policies to support Black artists and artists of color. At the Alliance, we're making sure that our programs are at least giving 50% of the room is being given to BIPOC artists. So we need to go further, we need to do more, and we're figuring out how we're gonna do that. Thank you for listening.
All right, I have a question, and it is, will the Alliance for Arts be advocating for UBI?
UBI being, universal basic income. Yes, we are. We certainly are pushing it at the federal level, which I think is where it's going to come from, but we are also in our finance presentations going to talk about that. We think the tricky part there is that we need to be asking for universal basic income for everyone, not just artists, because we're often seen as, we don't want to be seen as separate from society. We want to be seen as part of the society. So that's the stance we're taking.
Thank you. Another question is Brenda interested in hearing from BIPOC artists' voices outside of BC, such as Toronto artists?
Absolutely, absolutely. Very interested. The Canadian Arts Coalition is, really on a point of change right now. We need a lot more BIPOC voices there to bring their issues to the forefront. We work a lot with BIPOC artists, and I'm always welcome to, always want to hear from BIPOC artists and know what I can do, to help to be an ally.
I have a comment here that says, given the sort of precarities on BIPOC artists and their voices in this particular moment, what are white-dominated organizations doing to ensure their senior staff is diverse and representative with real power? I don't know. It's just a comment or a question to throw out to the forum.
Yeah, we need to make sure that we do have diversity in our staff. We can do better there. We have one person of color, we have one gay person, and then there's 2 of us older white women. So we're very aware of it, in that is the makeup of our staff, and we're trying to do more. But we do things like do step aside and offer leadership opportunities and curation opportunities to other folks, as I talked about. We need to do more for individual artists. I know that individual artists are suffering more than the rest, and we are working on a couple of initiatives. And actually, we did work on one initiative with, we had a donation because of a letter writing campaign we did. One of our philanthropists, who's a huge supporter of the arts, stepped up to the plate and donated $100,000. Half of that money went to a fund at the Vancouver Foundation for Organizations, and the other half we were able to steer it to the BC Arts Council for individual artists to get $1,500 grants. So that was one thing we did. We're also right now working on an initiative, but I can't talk about it because it hasn't been announced. But it will be, again, very similar to what you're talking about with the Hal Jackman Foundation for BIPOC artists in terms of a fund to support them.
And one last question here in this section is, could you elaborate? Someone missed the announcement about the media not covering the arts. Could you quickly elaborate or tell us more or where to find this info?
I saw it on Twitter just before I came into this conversation today. Michael Wheeler if you know Michael Wheeler, he is a white guy who was running the Full Day Festival and left and is now teaching at Queen's. But it's all over Twitter. It was an announcement by the Canadian media company that owns a lot of the newspapers, including our Georgia Straight, which has always been about the arts in Vancouver. Now they're saying if you just Google it, you'll find it. It's everywhere. That's where I saw it, and so I wanted to make sure people were aware of it. We should be doing something about that. We should speak up.
Thank you, Brenda, and to those who asked questions. We're going to make a little switch in the order. Our next speaker is Camille Georgeson-Usher, and we'll have the same program, which Kevin will ask the questions after. But we need to switch with Alita Ishmael because Alita's got a 3:30 timeline that she has to move on to another meeting, so we want to make sure we get her in. And that would put Ben after Alita, so we can go in that direction. Sorry about the switch, but we did know the other day that Alita had to leave at a certain time, and we did promise to accommodate that. So if we can go on with Camille, wherever Camille is. Over to you.
Does Alita want to go before me, just in case? No? I'm seeing a shaking of head.
Yeah, I think we're okay. She said she had to go by 3:30, so we'll continue this way, if that's okay.
I'll watch my time. So hi everyone, I'm Camille Georgeson-Usher. I am the Executive Director of the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective. I'm also a PhD candidate at Queen's University, so I don't have a lot of time to do anything else. It kind of fills all my time. I'm just so happy to be a part of this conversation and to be invited again. Like, I love everything that SAPAMO is doing. It's just incredible. Providing the space for these conversations is so necessary and needed, not just now, but forever. So I'm, whatever we can do to help you guys get core funding, like, I'm all there for it. But I just kind of wanted to perhaps introduce the ACC a little bit more, but I have some kind of key points that I wanted to bring up today. But the ACC is a nonprofit organization. We are entirely Indigenous run and led. And we basically work to support and connect Indigenous curators across the world, predominantly here in what is now known as Canada, Turtle Island. And so we create a variety of programming to do this. One kind of main programming initiative that we do is through our gathering. So through the act of bringing people together to share space with one another, to talk to one another, and to present on the work that we're doing as a way of sharing knowledge and resources to build a stronger arts sector generally. But today I have kind of three main points that I wanted to bring up that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's come up in many different ways. So for us at the ACC, we've been thinking a lot about care. And so we once, it was also Camille, we're in Regina trying to plan our upcoming gathering, that the doors of all museums and galleries closed as we were there, and so we had to cancel our event as we were about to meet them with our partners. And so we just saw how affected our community was by the closing of these doors, and we just, in that moment, I think it was maybe like 2 hours when we started seeing Twitter posts and Instagram posts about people that were losing their contracts like minute by minute. And so we created a program called Curating Care. And through this program, we essentially just asked folks in our community to submit 2-minute videos talking about who they are, what they do, and how they integrate care in the work that they do. And then we paid an honorarium for this. This program is finished. We've run out of money for that, but we are about to launch a new initiative that I'm excited that I'll be able to announce it in the coming days. But yeah, that's just kind of what we're thinking about right now. A lot about care and how we can talk about care at this time. But beyond that, what this time of COVID-19 has presented to us is that we can't imagine going back to the way things were. In terms of institutions, like in regards to this conversation, perhaps not funding institutions specifically, but like capital I institutions, we just can't go back to the way that it has been going. And so the three main points that I wanted to bring up today were, one, we need to be holding institutions accountable now more than ever. Financial instabilities due to this global pandemic does not mean that racist, hierarchical, deeply colonial frameworks for how institutions function will simply disappear. We still need to do this work because, you know, financial instability is happening does not mean that people are miraculously not racist. Two, the ACC is trying to figure out how to develop resources, statistics, and how we can ensure that Indigenous BIPOC folks within institutions are being protected and are having their voices heard. And as I think one of the folks that asked the questions about power, like how BIPOC folks in these institutions, what are their jobs? Do they have any power to make change in the institutions? And I can tell you that the majority of the time is no, they don't have this power. And then three, I wanted to think about an idea that was brought forward by a scholar that I've followed for a long time, whose name is Ashton Crawley. And he talks a lot about this concept called otherwise possibility. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later in relation to an idea that I'm like thinking about, which is instituting. Yeah, and just thinking about institutions otherwise. Okay, so to start, I was thinking about this time and accountability for institutions in relation to how this kind of moment where institutions are struggling to know where the next financial means is going to come from. And if we think about it in relation to funding bodies, particularly in kind of the opening remarks that were made, that you know, who's getting funding? Who are the organizations and institutions getting the majority of funding from arts councils right now? And what are these institutions doing to support BIPOC folks working within them, or even that the majority of Indigenous folks within or with museums are only being brought in on contract basis, whether that be temporary exhibitions, curators are being brought in specifically just for that, curating that exhibition, or that you know, curators will often just have one kind of job, which is to curate, or I should say Indigenous curators have the job of being the Indigenous Curatorial Fellow or having a specific mandate just to curate Indigenous themed exhibitions. And I really want to challenge that because I think BIPOC folks often get pigeonholed into specific conversations, but we need to show that we have the ability to curate other things, and we don't, you know, our communities extend beyond just being Indigenous, and we need to show that we can do that, and our position titles need to show that we are making this commitment. And so what I have been advocating for a lot, just in my work at the ACC, is from the ACC's founding, we started as an organization or as a collective of Indigenous curators who simply wanted jobs in the field. They weren't getting jobs. It was just, as I mentioned, this part-time or contract-based work. And so now that we have done a lot of advocacy work to get jobs in the field, simply just to get jobs, any jobs, like having a job in an institution to make any kind of change. So now that we're seeing this, what's happening now is that there are a lot of jobs being offered, but what are institutions doing to ensure that once an Indigenous person comes into their institution, how are they being upheld? How are their cultural practices understood fundamentally within that institution? And I think this comes down to how institutions develop policies, how they could change policies to actually support BIPOC folks that are within their spaces that could, you know, be more diverse, for lack of a better word. But I really just want to impress that institutions need to do better, and we need to show that BIPOC folks can make these really necessary changes. And right now, these conversations are what we need them to hear. So that's kind of, I mean, I have a lot more that I can say about that, but just to say in short that we need to hold institutions accountable to making change from within to support these positions, because we're not going away and we are going to hold positions within them. So having HR policies that reflect different cultural practices as a minimum. And then in terms of resources that the ACC is developing, we have just last week started building a database of who institutions are hiring. Mostly, like, we started this database just to see how many Indigenous folks and Black folks are holding positions in museums across the country. Firstly, just like as a minimum kind of stat to have. How many of these positions have any power within the institution? How long they're able to retain employees? How many? It's just kind of like, how many employees do they have that identify as BIPOC? But the thing that we're seeing that is maybe, you know, more interesting than the study itself are the institutions who will readily give us this information and will say, this is our full list of our team. You know, these are the folks that work in this department, you know, like just super open to giving us this information. But then there have been a lot of institutions that do not want to share this information. And so we have to do the work to research it and going through their website and, you know, trying to figure out how they support Indigenous curators, BIPOC curators in their institutions. And so that has flagged for me something that I want to bring up, which is if you don't know who, so the kind of framework that they have been suggesting to us is that they don't ask ethnicity of their employees. And so we are basically just wanting to suggest that if you don't know how somebody is identifying, how can you meet them on their level? And so we're basically hoping that this database that we're developing, like, it could be a tool to use, it could be something that's just stats that is useful, but that it shows that, you know, we just need to have more, what's the way to say it? More accountability from institutions to meeting us where we are and holding them accountable to respecting these very specific cultural lived needs. And so, I mean, I can say a lot about these projects, but I really just wanted to end by talking about this idea that I have. It's more theoretical, but there is an amazing quote, from Ashton Crawley, who I mentioned earlier, in a paper that he wrote in 2015. I think it was 2015, and the paper was called Otherwise Instituting. And I just think it speaks to a lot of how we can think about changing the structure of institutions right now. And so he says, quote, "Institutions are categorical distinctions. They are spaces that have been set apart after the repetition and reiteration of particular performances." He then asks, what then would it mean to contend with otherwise instituting? Perhaps considering instituting not as a thing that is graspable, but as vibratory, not an object of enlightenment epistemologies, but as ongoing process, ongoing becoming. Perhaps then we can encounter otherwise possibilities. What would an institution be if it were open to process, if it were open to the movement of spirit? And end quote. And so I just kind of wanted to end with this idea, which is a question to folks that are thinking about these conversations, that are maybe working within institutions that haven't spoken up for how the institution is functioning. So how might we collectively imagine what these institutions could be outside of what they are. And I deeply feel that Ashen is asking us to think about this and to think about what is outside of what we are comfortable with. And so it is a challenge and it is going to be uncomfortable. But when, like, my question is, when has anything that has changed been comfortable? And so that is my call to everyone, is to engage in these uncomfortable spaces that might be strange, but also to hold institutions accountable right now. It is a time that we need to show that we aren't not going to speak up. We are always going to speak up because we are still here and we still have to engage in these institutions. So we might as well create good spaces for people to work and change the structure so that it actually encompasses the people that might engage with them. I think I'm going to end there. I could go on for a long time, obviously. But yeah, I think that's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Camille. Over to you, Kevin.
All right. At this point, any questions? I'll ask again.
Ding, ding.
Here we go. What is the best way for an institution to evolve and have a diverse board? Is it the job of the staff to make the change?
Oh, like just for board diversity generally?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. It should never be the responsibility of the staff. I mean, boards need to be more responsible and more aware of who is on the board. I think that, like, I have often said, and many of my mentors have said, that they will generally not join a board if they're the only one. And so as an Indigenous woman, I will avoid being the only one in a room. So if you're asking one Indigenous person to be on your board and the rest are white, for lack of a better word, I am not going to join that group because I will have to do advocacy work for everyone, and that is not my job, and it is emotionally exhausting. As many people know, it will, it's just so emotionally exhausting. But then outside of that, like just in terms of staff, I have often heard Indigenous staff members being referred to as the only working water fountain in an institution, like theoretically as the only working water fountain in terms of knowledge, in terms of life-giving, in terms of, how everybody in the institution engages with Indigenous conversations. And that's a problem if you are hiring one Indigenous person to do the decolonial work for everyone. And I think that that issue would be resolved if boards were just inherently more diverse. And if we had, not just Indigenous folks, obviously, but BIPOC folks that would represent people that might want to come to that gallery. I'm not going to go to a gallery for the most part that only has white board members, for example. I could say a lot more about board stuff, but I think I'd get into rickety territory, so I'm just going to stop.
One more question.
One more question where possible. And also we'll have a session that will be based specifically on boards and diversification of boards. Do join us for that one.
I should also say that I can put my email in the chat, and if people want to talk to me, we are actively building these resources, and we want institutions to see them and read them and look at them and see how you can engage in more. I'm really trying not to use the word decolonial. I have a bit of a strange relationship to it. I think that it has been overused and should be reserved for Indigenous people to make stronger again. But I should say that we are creating these tools so that institutions can treat our community better. So I will share my email so people can contact me.
Thank you, Camille.
I see another question here based on boards and equitable conversation. And I want to just be mindful that the conversation for the most part is around the precarity of organizations during COVID, but I'll still air it here. Again, for this particular person, maybe this is something that is held in some of our other sessions coming up. It says, we've seen in some cases that representation doesn't always equal equity. What are your thoughts on how we can really make institutions more equitable? And I'll just give that to Charles, and you have 1 minute.
Yeah, you know, in making institutions equitable and following up on what Camille had just said, is you have to go through a thorough self-examination about who you are, what you profess to be doing, who's engaged in your work, and how you are engaging, particularly, you know, and clearly identify. I mean, there's no mystery about when we talk about priority groups or marginalized people or indigenous people or BIPOC, BIPOC, people of color. I mean, there's no way of getting around who's been outside the door. And the question then comes to what power do people have when they are in an institution? Are they there as, let's say, a token? Let's be honest about it. As Camille is saying, one person, one indigenous person. Are they, you know, immediately asked to talk about every issue that can fall within what people think, like she just said, the water fountain? They can answer everything. So what kind of pressure is that? And then what is the programming that an organization is doing so it's beyond simply, here's our poster boy, girl, whatever, on equity, to here are the programs that we operate, here's the degree to which indigenous people, racialized people, and break it down in terms of racialized people, we're not all the same. We're not all the same. And in terms of the deaf and disabled, low income, etc. Like, what is your real intent? If equity is about coming to equality of outcomes, that we share similar resources, that we have a better understanding of each other, as you know, a couple talked about building social cohesion, then that's what we're talking about. But we'll talk about that a bit more in our next session, which we're looking at the responsibility of boards in that regard, and what should they be doing to ensure that they follow along this path. That's a longer answer than I probably should have given because we've got a couple of other speakers. Just kidding, right? So we can move on to our next speaker, if that's okay. Lita Ishmael, coming from Montreal, doing work there as mentioned earlier, and Diversity Artistique Montreal. Lita, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Charles. Can you hear me okay? Just a little thumbs up, awesome. So before I get started, I just want to mention that throughout this whole COVID crisis, I've been intimately reminded of my inability to sit still for more than an hour and a half behind a screen. So I just want to invite you as I start to maybe just join me in taking like a little stretch to hopefully make that feel a little bit better. And as I get started, just because it wasn't fully mentioned at the beginning, because we are across Canada for this, that I am located in Donoghue, Montreal, and this land is the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which I am located today. It's historically known as a gathering for many First Nations and is now home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. So I just want to acknowledge the Montreal there. So I'm going to just mention that the final reflection that I want everyone to take away today, I'm going to mention it now. So it's really in your head throughout my whole presentation, is how can we open a pan-Canadian working group to see how we can create a link between the COVID crisis and the racism crisis in a way that would have lasting structural transformation. So I'm going to say that again. How can we open a pan-Canadian working group to see how we can create a link between the COVID crisis and the racism crisis in a way that would have lasting structural transformation. So with that in your heads, let's backtrack a little. Who am I? I am the research officer at Diversité Artistique Montréal, Artistic Diversity Montreal, rough translation. And I'm also an independent dance and theater artist. I was originally born in Burlington, Ontario, but I've been a Montrealer for the last 12 years. So I'll say I'm a Montrealer now. So DAM for short, Diversité Artistique Montréal, was founded in 2004, and it was born really out of a day that was focused on cultural diversity from the Montreal Arts Council. And in 2006, we became an independent body, and we are a non-for-profit. And we are now, I've recently joined, so I don't have the full, history ingrained in my mind, but we are now a team of about 20, no, that's not true at all. We're now a team of about 10, and that's mixing part-time and full-time employees. At DAM, we have two main branches. So the first branch is around supporting our artists. So we have a membership database mainly comprised of racialized and immigrant artists of all disciplines. So when we talk about diversity, we really are focusing on the one type of diversity, which is cultural. So we don't specialize in the other types of diversity, but we do recognize that there are evidently many types. So we have a membership database across disciplines, and we really try and offer them support to either integrate into the system here in Quebec, learn how to apply for grants, learn other career development activities that they may not be familiar with already. And then our second branch is really focused on accompanying arts and cultural organizations and institutions. So two main components there. We have what's called the Cellule IDAM, and they give a resource or service to organizations who want to have a bit more of like a handheld approach of going delving deeper into their practices. We do a full kind of assessment of their policies, their staff. We interview people, we look at their website, and kind of give an audit or a diagnostic of where they're at in terms of equity and inclusion in regards to cultural diversity. And after that process, we give them kind of adapted recommendations for what should be their next steps, or what do they still need to move forward on, where have they reached. And the beginning of that accompaniment is really starting with a awareness training that we're currently in the midst of not reformulating, but digging a little bit deeper to see if we can also create more training capsules that dig a little deeper into some of the concepts that are briefly mentioned in that first training. And also on that organization side is our research poll that was recently created in like 2016. And now I'm the research officer there working on another major project that I will get into very shortly. And before I get into that, just a little of how COVID-19 has impacted DAM and our artists. So first with DAM, we are very, very, very lucky to be supported by all three levels of government. So Montreal, Quebec, and with Canadian Heritage, and I think to Canada Council as well, if I speak correctly. I don't know exactly if any of that is functioning grants. Definitely in terms of research, which is where I'm mainly concerned and employed, it's only by project. So in 2 years, if we don't get another project, I'm gone. So our main challenge throughout this, since we are funded, we were really lucky to still be able to keep that funding and not have to lay anyone off at this time. And we were allowed to restructure a little bit our activities. But at the same time, a lot of uncertainty for the future. So what is that going to mean for future access to grants, or how councils are reorganizing funds at this moment, and what that's going to mean for future grants or the timeline after. And especially since we're not at least I'm not unfunctioning, the idea of, okay, we can use more time to use this project funding, but that for someone who's stable working on the project, that doesn't necessarily respond to all of our needs. So we've done a lot of work on transforming our activities online, which was never there before. And I'd say one of the biggest frustrations or impacts as DAM as an organization with all of this is right now there has been a lot of discussions with different levels of government for the return, for the deconfinement, and especially in the arts culture, with the Ministry of Arts and Culture and those conversations in Quebec. DAM is finding it really hard to find a spot around that table for some reason. You know, they've got the dance and music and theater, and, you know, where does diversity fit into that conversation? And as an organization, it's knocking on so many doors, and none of them are open to really be an equal part of that conversation around the table. So that's something that we are pushing. We're pushing hard. We're trying, and hopefully we're still hopeful that one step at a time will be seen as a major part that needs to be around that table. And then in terms of our membership, our artists, anecdotally, as I think it was Kristina that mentioned, the CERB was like the most stable that some of our artists have seen as well. So that's something to not look at lightly, or to see, or not to put to the side. And a lot of provincially, you know, CALC, which is the Quebec Arts Council, they did release certain emergency measures for artists, but only artists that they're currently supporting, or only organizations that they're currently supporting. So that begs to bring up a lot of questions around the systemic barriers that are already in place in some of these institutions and how they're just being perpetuated at this time. And you can still submit, you know, a new application as a first timer, but you wouldn't benefit from any of the extra measures. And we are hearing a lot that people are finding it hard to work, that on motivation, that not either having no physical space or access to their studios, and some even debating career changes. So we are in the midst, we just got approval for a tiny bit of funding to do an emergency survey with our members, and well, more than our members, but really around quote unquote culturally diverse artists, around, you know, what's the immediate future looking like for them. And hopefully we're going to be able to get some good statistics there that we can help for the advocacy portion for some of these arts councils. And then kind of the third branch that in terms of impact from COVID is the organizations that we work with. So the difficulty has a lot been with the fact that we're so stuck to what public health says we can do and cannot do, and they assess pretty much at like 15 days at a time, whereas, for example, the Quebec Arts Council goes more at like 2-3 months at a time. So there's a lot of barriers that have been brought up there about how to adapt so quickly and how to get things, you know, flowing through. And so right now Quebec is in a deconfinement phase. I'm not sure what number. But in terms of the arts, the first has really been visual arts. So museums were allowed to open, and then also audiovisual, so some recording studios and stuff, and libraries. And so there has been a lot of, you know, backlash from the performance arts sector of that, where it just hasn't been in the conversation much. So it is anticipated, if all goes well, the end of June, that some theaters and stuff could open, but again, rehearsals for artists and access to rehearsal studios has not yet been defined. So we're really battling a lot of these different areas, but there has still been some openness to use this time for more transformational transformation within the organizations, notably the Montreal Arts Council. And then we do have an open conversation with Canadian Heritage to see how, you know, different funding structures could flow into DAM to partner with our Salud accompaniment to other organizations that they support to really, again, bring up the, amp up the emphasis on transforming practices to be more equitable. So back to our research in 2016, we did in 2018 publish a report that was a consultation of the arts sector here in Montreal, and it emitted 31 recommendations specifically targeted to arts and cultural organizations on how to, like, giving actionable recommendations on how to transform their practices, and that report can be seen on our website. And so my project right now is an action research project with 12 organizations and really piloting the implementation of these recommendations so that they don't just sit in a report on someone's bookshelf. And so we've had a good response with that. And we did a launch at the end of January, and then bam, COVID hit. And what's been really interesting is that how COVID-19 has again shown how that diversity dossier or folder or project, where that lies on people's priorities list when an emergency comes in. So again, we're really asking a lot of questions of how can these organizations be, show true engagement and hold them accountable. So we are still moving forward with our project, and we're hoping that with the survey we'll do with that we're launching pretty much in the next couple of days for racialized and immigrant artists, that will be able to back up some of those, some of the accountability and ramp up the conversation around that. And so I'm hoping that maybe this project, which we're calling the PAC project because it's towards a concerted action plan, un plan d'action concerté in French. We're hoping that maybe this type of engagement to test at least some of these recommendations can act as a model for people in this moment to transform their practices right when they're trying to go back into the normal way of doing things that we all hope is not going back to the way it was done before. So I will bring back the question again of what we're really questioning, especially in the research poll and at DAM in general, is how can we open a pan-Canadian working group to see how we can create a link between the COVID crisis and the racism crisis in a way that would have lasting structural transformation. They do not need to be seen as two different things to manage separately. And I think that these really need to come together and overlap, and the accountability needs to be there. And so we don't have all the answers, but that's definitely what we are pushing in this time with our partners.
Thanks, Alita. And we should talk about that. We will. Mm-hmm. Any questions? I know this is a lot. It's a long afternoon. Thanks for the stretch there, Alita. I think we all needed it. If there are, because we have two more speakers, and I certainly want to give them time, I'm not seeing any questions at this point. No? Okay, we'll move on. Thanks again, Alita, and yeah, we'll catch up. Ben Donoghue of Media Arts Network Ontario. Just to give a bit of background, this session today comes out of conversations that Ben, Jason, and I have had over the past month or so in terms of the advocacy, the paper we've done, the letters they've written. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Charles, and thank you, Kevin and Victoria, for organizing and handling the logistics. It's much appreciated. So there's a few things I wanted to talk about today around work Mano's been doing and other connected structures. So Mano, the Media Arts Network of Ontario, is an art service organization working with media arts, artist-run organizations, collectives, also a lot of visual arts collectives and organizations. And we've always operated from a responsive and strong political stance, and never focused on advocacy from a narrow perspective. Always trying to look beyond the interests of just say our members and think about what's the interest of the arts sector as a whole and society as a whole. And that may involve sometimes working against some of the narrowly perceived interests of some of our member organizations at times. So it's how do we always ensure that the advocacy work, the capacity building work we do as an arts service organization doesn't get stuck into looking for that short-term benefit, that kind of member service of we're going to help those people who are our members now and make sure they're doing well without thinking about who do we actually want to see, where do we want to see the sector change and become. So in that, over the last couple months, our work has not so much shifted but accelerated and moved from in-person conversations. We typically spend a lot of time traveling the province. We gave up our office maybe 4 or 5 years ago and put all that money to travel, to spend time in communities, just sitting with people, working through whatever issues are happening on a local level, on within the regions, what individual artists, emerging collectives may need, and supporting really development processes. And we've had to figure out how to move all that online. And a lot of it's lost, to be honest, online, coming from a media arts perspective, a lot of it doesn't even translate. You need that human-to-human engagement, but we do the best we can. So we've been meeting with our membership, but also assembling broader groups from across Ontario or across the country. One focused on small organizations, emerging collectives, others focused on online artist fees, others on Northern Ontario artists and organizations and collectives, trying to really develop a dialogue on what's happening. Out of that, one of the campaigns that developed is the one Charles mentioned, which was a recent letter to the Canada Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council concerning small emerging organizations and collectives, and really focusing on the precarity of labor, but not only the precarity in which we understand it typically, of the chance of not getting a grant. Maybe, you know, you are successful one year, not successful the other, but built into that very system of project grants, of the way the arts councils have structured granting for so many programs where a lot of the back end is ineligible, where you find an expectation of volunteer labor, particularly in small and emerging groups. So as you're building something, as you're working with a small collective, a small organization, there's this incredible expectation of unpaid, underpaid labor over time that would never be accepted in a agency or department, even within large organizations. And there's been a continual dismissal of labor standards and the attempt to care for and maintain those labor standards. We've been regularly told by the councils over the years that things like proper wages and salaries are not their problem. And having to put it forward once again and assert that this is required. And it isn't optional. It shouldn't just be large organizations, large institutions that have the ability, but we know to pay their staff properly. There shouldn't be these expectations, and they're manufactured by the arts councils, but within our community, and there's something that needs to change. So in that letter, you can find it. It's been circulating on social media, on our website. People can sign on to it. We've been asking for the creation of a sustaining program for small organizations and collectives who are not on core funding with the councils. And this would be to pay wages and salaries only, not to pay consultants, not to pay for programming, but to pay people to do the back-end work that often isn't covered in a programming grant. isn't covered in that other areas of what the councils are funding. So really demanding that recognition of labor, of adequate compensation, and the importance of that at all scales of organizations. It doesn't mean a group comes together and founds a new organization, and regardless of its importance, everyone is expected to work for free because someone is still bitter that they maybe did that 30, 40 years ago. That was unacceptable then, and it's unacceptable now. So trying to push to see some change and one modest program, and we know it's part of a larger piece of asserting labor standards, that artist fees are one piece of a puzzle, but also the support for all aspects of the chain of creation, and knowing that organizations and small and emerging organizations are extraordinarily important as a means of self-determination and alternate expression, where we know that the large institutions are often slow, unresponsive, and don't change. People are struggling, and slowly after years, we're starting to see small, modest, incremental gains. But the small organizations are things we can determine and can be responsive to communities immediately. And we need to also, while we work to change those large institutions, create adequate support structures. So that's one piece we've been working on. We have received a response from Ontario Arts Council that's been open to dialogue, and that dialogue is moving forward. They're hoping to work with us and a number of small groups, and we'll try and extend that circle working on it, to bring forward labor standards for arts workers as a critical issue for the Canadian public arts funders meetings over the next couple years, and ensuring that programs at all the arts funders do include labor standards for cultural workers. As far as the immediate term, that question that Charles posed at the beginning of redistribution was, of course, that first thing we were told that before the offer to work with us on long-term solutions was there is no new money. So at this point now, does mean going back and saying you have to prioritize. And it's at this historical juncture, you have to pick and choose. You can't say, we're going to keep funding the 8 major organizations as the largest line in Ontario Arts Council's budget and then expect hundreds of people to work for free. It's just unacceptable. So trying to figure out how we can move through that dialogue, but do so in a respectful way where we can maintain a collaborative relationship and hope to move this just beyond a few arts councils and really talk about what this means nationally, what it can mean as a national standard that all provinces, territories, municipal funders adhere to. So some other things we've been working on that tie into this, we've shifted our advocacy work into an affinity group model from our standard working committee, and have broken into a series of affinity groups that are broader than just our membership, working on issues such as income precarity and housing security, online artist fees, a range of issues that affect the media arts sector, but also have broader implications. Out of that, a few initiatives have developed. One is called Caseworks, and it's a very simple lo-fi initiative. It's just a booking system through the Mano website. People can volunteer to provide support to others in the community, sign up to offer half-an-hour sessions, free and confidential, and it's open to anyone. So simple lo-fi ways that we can provide peer-to-peer support, because it's what we've always used as the core of our model, is helping each other and supporting each other through struggles and using the struggle as the act together as the act to kind of build cohesion, build understanding. Another thing we're working on is the beginnings of discussions and campaigns around universal basic income. We've had a working group, an affinity group focused on this for about 2 months now. There is a public meeting coming up that's a bit more closed than public, but semi-public meeting coming up in a couple weeks. We're also looking forward to working with UBI Ontario and UBI Canada. I saw Craig Bergold, who's working with them to develop a UBI campaign in the sector of the arts within UBI Canada. So we're hoping to work with Craig and having an initial other conversation around what an arts campaign can look like that may be separate, may be tied in. And I think there's a bunch of other stuff going on, but I think for now that would cover it for the quick thing.
Thank you, Ben. Questions of Ben? Not seeing any right now. I want to add something.
There is one.
Okay, go ahead.
It says, I wonder if there might be an opportunity to discuss with arts funders, in brackets, maybe not specifically for Ben to answer right now, but I want to put it out here since he's talking about this. How arts funders word, in brackets, that spending may only occur after the application is submitted, in close quotes. This type of wording shows that they are not considering paying for the labor involved in asking for money to do the projects, i.e. those who are writing grants almost never receive money to write the grants, and it's just considered, quotation marks, free labor. I have,
I would say, just in quick response, that both of the Arts Council, both Canada Council and OAC, I'm not sure other provinces or territories, but both of those funders are currently in strategic planning processes, and they rarely adequately consult doing those processes, and even more rarely do they support or consult with BIPOC artists, small organizations, collectives, rural and remote communities. And we're really pushing management at both councils to make sure that that happens this time. And I think those kind of questions are really important to be part of that process.
Okay, any other questions? I see, nope.
One other thing I just wanted to add to Ben's comment about and I'll show this chart because I think it really is helpful to what we're talking about. This is what I wanted to start with, what I mentioned at the top today. Right? This just came out in January. It's not the first time that Hill Strategies has come up with this kind of documentation. Hill Strategies is funded by, guess who? Canada Council and the Ontario Arts Council. So they can't say they don't know this. And when Ben was talking about the disparity between large arts organizations in terms of income for administrators and small arts organizations, I'm reminded of a colleague of Kevin and mine, and probably some of you were here, who uses the term being on the plantation. And I'm using that in this time of Black Lives Matter to talk about that experience of how organizations, particularly creative or administrative, that work with such precarious funding lose the people that we have to these other organizations that can pay them better. We become the training ground. We become the training ground. And if they cannot be moved by this, in terms of, as I said at the outset, what equity means, I mean, if that's the top earning level, then we should all be there. We should not see this. That's an $11,000 difference. We should not see this, a $9,000 difference. We should not see this, for women, a $5,000 difference between what men are making. And yet we do. And they put this out in the public domain. Enough on that. We'll go to our final speaker, not final in terms of this overall issue, because I think there's a lot of things that have come up that are helping us to look at how we might connect after today, and that certainly is our interest. Jason of CARFAC, Ontario. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Charles. Hey, folks. So I'm Jason Samilski. I'm with CARFAC Ontario. We are the the Association of Professional Visual and Media Artists here in Ontario. We do a lot of things. We provide like a range of professional resources and supports for artists, including publications and toolkits, and we offer individual consultation on a variety of professional issues. We offer access to pro bono legal consultation, and we do a lot of advocacy. So to try and improve systems in ways that the lives and careers of artists may flourish, and that we can have a strong and equitable cultural ecosystem. So for us right now, this means focusing on improving infrastructure and supports specifically for artists identifying as Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ, deaf and disabled, newcomers, and also those who experience systemic barriers to participating in the arts. So we know that barriers like mental health issues and literacy, intergenerational poverty, access to employment and education, involvement with the justice system, amongst other complex barriers, can really preclude great and important artists from developing their careers and contributing to our cultural narrative. So that's like the focus of CARFAC Ontario these days. And amid when COVID-19 started, and we saw the flurry of relief efforts being created, we were immediately concerned that despite good intentions, that systems were really just not in place to get that relief to artists living and working on the margins, cultural leaders, and marginalized communities, and relief to many high impact arts initiatives that we know are doing really important work on the community and grassroots level. But if they can't get that support, they could all but be wiped out. So, we also know that most small groups led by and intended to serve marginalized communities already exist in considerable precarity and really are the most vulnerable in a crisis like this. So, many of the groups, we also know that many of these groups are filling really important gaps in culture by engaging communities that might not otherwise see themselves reflected in, and frankly, are excluded from conventional arts institutions and subsequently from our larger cultural narrative. And, the fact is that the systems have not been in place to support marginalized artists and cultural leaders before the pandemic. And what we're seeing is that COVID-19 simply acted as a powerful accelerant for the inequity within the arts sector. So our first step with CARFAC Ontario was to really try to spotlight that issue on a very high level. So we put together an open letter, which right now is signed by, I think, around 70 artists and cultural leaders. And again, we wanted to make sure that relief, COVID-19 and pandemic-related relief, was being positioned in a way that was reaching arts organizations that were small, emerging, and led by marginalized groups. And we know that those groups often are not able to access the same kinds of relief measures that were being put forth. So things like rent subsidies and wage subsidies and loans and grants and other measures, the smaller groups and initiatives happening on the community level, really, it's not really relevant for a lot of those folks. So we addressed this open letter to the Ontario Minister of Heritage, Sport, Tourism and Culture Industries, Lisa MacLeod, and there was no response from that office. And we also addressed that letter to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Stephen Guilbeault. So Canadian Heritage did respond, and they expressed interest in this issue, and they wanted to discuss and learn more. So soon after this, Canadian Heritage also announced their $500 million emergency support fund for cultural heritage and sport organizations. And in that was a stated intention to provide relief to groups who are more susceptible to falling through the cracks and those who aren't accessing other forms of pandemic associated with relief. So we thought this is good news. However, what we soon saw is that really the lion's share of those funds were going to flow, and they already did, to existing clients of Canadian Heritage Portfolio organizations and those already associated and clients of the Canada Arts Council. This method, to be clear, continued to exclude smaller groups that don't receive operating funding and frankly have a history of, or rather don't have any history of being funded by those agencies. So, I mean, and again, not to mention that kind of system, despite all good intentions, really does exclude those facing other systemic barriers. So literacy, access to stable internet connection, and complicated application processes, and really coming to it from a history of feeling and being totally disenfranchised from the Arts Canada Council and from other major public funding bodies. So, I mean, this was, you know, this is an issue. So at the same time, we at CARFAC, we started speaking with some other folks, several arts service organizations. So with CARFAC National, we were also speaking with Ben at Mano, the Canadian Crafts Federation, the Artist-Run Centers and Collectives Conference, and the Nipissing Region Curatorial Collective, and also, and Charles here at SAPAMO. And so we got talking and we got to work. And really, though the structure to disseminate the first part of that $500 million fund was already in place, we were, and we remain encouraged by the intention of what Canadian Heritage is calling the phase 2 of the dissemination of that fund. So there has been, and we know, a stated intention to direct phase 2 funds at groups that are not current clients of Canadian Heritage or Canada Council. And we know there's an interest in our conversations. We know there's an interest from department staff, policy advisors there, and we understand from Minister Guilbeault himself to make sure that these funds are truly accessible to members of equity-seeking groups, which again are great intentions, but it's always about the design of that process, which is so important. So we started having conversations and kind of started hammering away, and we submitted a series of recommendations to Canadian Heritage that we hope will result in phase 2 funds being disseminated in ways that are relevant and accessible to small groups and collectives, specifically those led by and serving marginalized communities. So to do that, what we proposed was kind of like a third-party recommender model. So essentially here, the goal is to decentralize the funding process and rather center the process directly within communities. So this is a model where local arts organizations that frankly are much more connected with their communities and what's happening on the ground level could support applicants, or rather start with the outreach process, help get the word out about this funding opportunity, act as a contact point between the applicant and Canada Council, and then at the end, recommend to the council which groups are best positioned and most viable to receive the support. You know, it's not really reinventing the wheel here. Similar models are being employed right now by the Ontario Arts Council and others. And also this third-party recommender model that we're encouraging right now, it's really scalable in that organizations, local arts organizations could be tapped to simply just act as an outreach arm to help engage and encourage applications from groups that might not otherwise be applying. But they could also be engaged to offer mentorship and support in writing grant applications, support throughout completing projects, And then just finally it would be left up to the council or to the funding body to cut the check. So we're still waiting to hear, at least I am, I don't know, I think we're still all waiting to hear back about the direction forward with those phase 2 funds. However, this kind of like decentralized funding model, it's not only relevant now during a pandemic and for funds associated with relief efforts, but really this kind of model could, moving forward, increase access to funds for many artists and groups that right now are just totally disenfranchised from funding systems at any level. And I mean, this kind of thing can happen in a lot of ways, and we've offered our partnership and collaboration. But first, before any of this, we need public funding agencies to participate in these conversations, express willingness to make hard decisions, express willingness to make major changes, and realize through their actions that the status quo is no longer working. Because we have here a powerful opportunity for funding agencies to send a really strong message to marginalized communities. And it might be time to do that. So as a sector, I mean, this has been brought up before, but I just really want to underscore it again, that we're always talking about, oh, if there's new funding available. And I feel like the narrative is so commonly placed in how much arts funding is available, and we want more arts funding. And yes, we do, but we really need to be looking at how that funding is disseminated, who are the recipients of those funds, and what communities are ultimately the beneficiaries of those public funds. Because, you know, at the same time, this pandemic has been totally devastating in so many ways. But like Brenda was saying, there's great opportunity here, and we are seeing a willingness from public funders and from others in the sector to begin these conversations that, in my experience, were much harder to gain traction for before this crisis. You know, in my view, it's kind of like a forest fire is happening right now, and this is of unprecedented scope, being unprecedented seemingly being the word of the last few months here, right? But, you know, forest fires are devastating, but they're also a very important part of the ecosystem. They wipe out a lot, but they're devastating, to be clear, but they also play an important role in renewing growth. And I kind of think that in this devastation, you know, what we get to see is new places for the sun and the rain to come down and shine, and we get to see places where there wasn't any chance for growth before, you know. So, I mean, I feel strongly that the arts has the capacity. Indeed, I feel like the arts has the responsibility to address these urgent issues and really use our sector in the arts to offer a framework for the kind of society that we really want to live in. And like I'm saying, right now, I do feel like there's great opportunity for change. We really, really need to make sure we do this right. And I am eager to speak with others in the sector and beyond, really, about how we can work together to see these kinds of changes, how CARFAC Ontario can offer its resources and platform to collaborate with others to move forward in the right direction. Yeah, you know, and I also want to express my deepest appreciation and gratitude to the SAPAMLA team for organizing this. Everyone on the panel today for all the work you do today and every day, and for everyone else who came together today to be part of this really important conversation. So you know, I know it's a long one, so thanks for sticking around and being part of this. And yeah, I hope that we can continue the conversation.
Thanks, Jason. Any questions or comments? I know it's been a long afternoon, and again, I want to echo Jason's comment. We really appreciate your involvement. And one thing I just wanted to share again, if I can do another screen share here, is this is the quote of Justice Abella. And you can see where we put the bolding, right? I want to read it. To create equality of opportunity, we have to do different things for different people. We have to systematically eradicate the impediments to these options according to the actual needs of different groups, not according to what we think their needs should be. In other words, we should be the author of what we believe our needs are, not the councils. Because obviously when they say priority groups, I don't know what they're talking about. And secondly, she adds, and we have to give individuals an opportunity to use their abilities according to their potential and not according to what we think their potential should be. The process is an exercise in redistributive justice. Its object is to prevent the denial of access to society's benefits because of distinctions that are invalid. Because of distinctions that are invalid. Us being locked out of systems for the time we have been since the Massey Commission was established were based upon faulty grounds, faulty reasoning, and ruled us as people who did not deserve the attention European peoples and art forms did. Those ideas, those arguments are invalid. So we have to kind of remind them all the time of this. Sorry, I just should have asked if there were questions that Kevin has for Jason, but as he's doing that, I thought I would just throw that in. You're muted there, Kevin.
Yeah, there were no questions thus far. So if anyone has any questions, we're at 5 minutes to the technical end of the session. You can definitely place those here now.
Okay, seeing none, I do want to thank all the panelists for their time. I really have, as we constructed this panel, as you can see, I think we made diversity meaningful, if I can use that term, in terms of being gender balanced, in terms of the perspectives that have come from different communities, in terms of showing that there are whites who are very strong allies to the causes of BIPOC artists and arts organizations and administrators, and that we can see this as we go forward into the next phases. You know, every moment, Kevin and I, we keep going back and trading quotes from Cornel West, and he talks about civilization only moves in crisis. We are in a crisis. There's no doubt about it. And our voices now need to be heard louder than ever in this crisis moment, because sometimes crises leave us behind, and we cannot be left behind. We cannot be left behind anymore. It's enough. It really is more than enough. You know, I come out of the States, and my teenage years growing up listening to Black leaders saying, I'm tired. I'm tired. And it's 500 years, and we're not even the inhabitants of this land. We got dragged here, you know? So how much more difficult it is for indigenous peoples who saw their nations, their languages, their cultures, their well-being, their way of life pushed aside. We must be extraordinarily tired. And if we really believe in truth and reconciliation, or at least truth, and we can get on to reconciliation, if we really believe in Black Lives Matter, if we really believe that the way we've imported labor into this country, whether it was the Chinese, the South Asians, etc., to solve our sort of labor shortage issues, making this as a new country in a new world, whatever we call it, and Canada may not be the appropriate name, then we've got to act now to make this happen. We cannot wait to see who's going to be left out at the end of the day. When we started the Sapamo paper, we made it really clear we cannot watch COVID wipe out the very small gains we have made in the last 20 years. And it may do that, which means the arts councils will start all over again. And you know who they'll likely blame? They'll blame us. Like, wow, thank you very much for your attention. Anyway, stay tuned. I'm sure there'll be more coming out of this conversation. More action. Oh, we got a question. Hey, maybe.
Okay, I think it's Kathy Boland that had to leave. I'll put her information in the group before you all go.
So again, I want to thank everybody. Please, if you have issues, whatever, please email Sapamo. You can email any of the participants, the panelists. They've left their email addresses. If you didn't catch it, get to Kevin, me, or Victoria Glitzer. We'll be happy to share it with you. The letters of Media Arts Network and CARFAC are on the chat box, so please copy them. The Sapamo paper is in the chat box. Take good care, everyone. Let's keep our eye on the prize, as we say, and let's move forward together, recognizing that if we're going to name quote unquote priority, at least we will treat priorities as priorities, and we will demand that of those who say there are priority groups. Prioritize us now, because we may not be here tomorrow. Or if we are here tomorrow, you may not like the way we come back. If you think this is something, just wait. Yeah. Anyway, have a good afternoon, everyone. We'll talk soon.